still reeling from this morning's announcement, possibly the most significant event in recent history. We repeat, the Superman exists, and he is American.
It's 1974. President Nixon has clung to power for 2 bitter years. Authoritarian and paranoid, Nixon has established criminal organizations within the White House to engage in break-ins, illegal wiretapping, and other acts of sabotage against his political opponents. In response to one such break-in, of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington becoming public, Nixon has personally authorized a coordinated campaign of misinformation and destruction of evidence to conceal the White House's direct involvement. The prolonged investigation has dragged on for years, leading to one bad news story after another. Nixon refuses to turn over tapes. Sections of tapes are wiped. Nixon's vice president has to resign. Nixon dodges taxes and enriches himself illegally. And Nixon has lied repeatedly and directly to the public about the whole thing. Soon, congressional Republicans will decide he's more trouble than he's worth and persuade him to resign. But while Nixon will leave office, and while his personal approval of the cover-up will become public, and while more than 40 officials, including his chief of staff, his White House counsel, his personal attorney, and 2 attorneys general, will be convicted in connection with the break-in or the cover-up, Nixon will never admit wrongdoing. One can invent a sympathetic figure out of attributes Nixon had, that he came from poverty and challenged the bluest of the blue bloods, that given clerking work during World War II, he sought a transfer to more active duties, and distinguished himself in the Pacific, that his strange sort of anti-charm gives the impression of straightforwardness, that a politician who does so little to ingratiate himself to you must be telling you the straight truth. In 1974, though, that sympathetic characterization seems absurd. The real Nixon, in the end, seems to believe in nothing but power. He's not an honest man. He's just a man so fixated on his quest for power that it doesn't occur to him to mask it, that it doesn't occur to him that others might find it distasteful. What policy achievements he has emerge not from moral conviction, but from an animal sense that policy challenges are potential political weaknesses. A desperately ambitious man, devoid of ideology, and certain that every setback was the result of conspiracies and communists. Yes, even the one political viewpoint that he seems truly wedded to, his unshakable anti-communism, is just a bludgeon he has used to attack every political opponent he has ever had. The launch of his career, his work with the House Un-American Activities Committee in the pursuit of a suspected Soviet spy named Alger Hiss, has long been tainted by the belief that he manufactured evidence. Soon he will be forced to resign. But by the end of the year, Nixon will be attempting to orchestrate his planned return to office. With assistance from rich friends and huge interview fees, he will quickly become quite wealthy. Seeking to present himself as an elder statesman, he will travel to Britain and to China. 20 years from now, when he dies, American intelligentsia will rush to monumentalize him, a push that will thankfully last only a brief time. Hunter Thompson will write an obituary. He was utterly without ethics, or morals, or any bedrock sense of decency. Nobody trusted him. He was a cheap crook and a merciless war criminal. When students at Kent State University protested the bombing, he connived to have them attacked and slain by troops from the National Guard. Nixon's spirit will be with us for the rest of our lives. This is not a generational thing. You don't even have to know who Richard Nixon was to be a victim of his ugly Nazi spirit. It's 1999. I'm, well, young. I'm reading Watchmen for the first time. I've never seen a comic do anything like this. I don't understand it, but I know it's good enough that it can go over my head. 23 years later, my biggest criticism of Watchmen will still be this. that it wants its audience to engage it in a way that is beyond the capacity of much of its audience and beyond the willingness of much of the rest of it. It's not the ideological, the archetypical conflict. That's the easy part. Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan and the comedian and Ozymandias, I respond to them all. Their absolutism and the way their absolutism gives them power over society. And it's not the critique of them underneath it, which even as a child I am able to start to see. It's the way the work sets against its time. Or against my own. The parts of the text that are doing that juxtaposition don't connect with me. I don't get yet why Sally Uspechik doesn't want to go by the name she was born with, or why she would have a consensual affair with a man who once tried to rape her. I don't understand why this pudgy, soft-hearted, unmotivated man-child, Dryburgh, this shitty Batman, gets more sympathy from the author than any of the more awesome characters. I see Rorschach's takedown of Dr. Long's effete liberalism, but not that the work is less interested in Rorschach's dunks and more interested in the collision of Rorschach's inhumanity and Dr. Long's imperfection. I see in the text how superheroes and comic books are used to engage with big topics. I see Richard Nixon there on the page, still the president, and I think to myself, holy crap, but I don't get yet why Alan Moore wants to say Richard Nixon is still the president. Oh, I think it's a dystopia, and that's not wrong exactly, but I don't know the texture of it. What he means when he says it's 1985 and Richard Nixon is the president of the United States. I didn't witness firsthand the long, slow slide that Watchmen observed and ultimately accidentally became a foundational part of, from Silver Age comics toward grim, hyper-violent ones. So I don't see how Watchmen investigates different eras and different kinds of superheroes as only an expert can, because in 1999 I am not yet knowledgeable enough to recognize the author's expertise when I see it. It's 1999. The President of the United States is a sex pest and has lied under oath. In 19 years, his wife, coming off her own campaign for president, will insist that the relationship between him, the President of the United States, and a 22-year-old intern was not an abuse of power. The Republican frontrunner to replace him is George W. Bush, a compassionate conservative and a non-interventionist, who will, after September 11th, oversee the greatest centralization of the security apparatus in American history and initiate a policy of constant global military intervention so complete that in 2022 we won't bother to even talk about it anymore. It's 2009. I am of exactly the age that the economy being in collapse in exactly this point of my life will affect me forever. President Bush has departed office, so unpopular he had to skip his own party's convention. His replacement is a young liberal law professor who, though he'll be stymied by his own careful instincts and political gridlock, has run on a campaign of hope and change we can believe in. No one's sure exactly what that means, but everyone could very badly use some hope. Over the next few years, he will expand U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Mali, and Yemen. In that case, backing a Saudi invasion and blockade that started a famine responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Most of these incursions will be undertaken, as the president will himself eventually admit, without clear foreign policy goals, let alone endgames. The US will begin targeting US citizens with drone strikes overseas, but all of that is for the next few years. It's 2009, and there's hope. And there's a Watchmen movie now. In a few years, the director, Zack Snyder, will become a culturally polarizing figure. Snyder is brilliant at composing powerful shots and, well, not much for understanding where that power comes from, what those images symbolically represent, and therefore not much for leveraging that communication towards something thematically intentional. But his Watchmen adaptation is to some degree immunized against that flaw. It's about as faithful an adaptation of the source work as possible, an adaptation so faithful that it sometimes comes across as something of a filmmaking exercise, a sort of challenge. Given this very complicated, visually striking graphic novel with enormous scope and dense with ephemera, do you have the mastery over all of the different parts of filmmaking to translate that onto film? And to be fair, Snyder absolutely does. But he also seems to understand the material the way I did 10 years earlier as a child. He is attracted to the powerful imagery and not to the context. Snyder is, by his own admission, not broadly invested in superhero comics as an art form, and doesn't seem to really see the discussion of their history, how Watchmen discusses the progression of comic book eras, or the way comics intersect with childhood fantasy, or the limitations black and white comic book sensibilities have for real-world issues. More than that, Snyder doesn't seem to recognize how other parts of the text work to contextualize, to undermine that powerful imagery, how elements of both visual and written style, like perspective and juxtaposition, are used to make that power seem, well, impotent. And again, it's hard to entirely blame him because the source text is speaking on levels that this medium's audience is unused to hearing, or unwilling to hear. Everyone gets to Watchmen as a deconstruction, but they mostly seem to feel that deconstruction stops at superheroes in real life would be scary, when this is where Watchmen starts, and not its entire message. Being scary is still a power fantasy, and among other things, what the graphic novel engages and the film misses is how those power fantasies are constructed and what they represent politically, socially, and mentally. So, Snyder's commitment to making a faithful adaptation is real, but where he has to turn panels into shots, has to simplify storylines, has to find subplots to cut, he consistently cuts and changes the parts of the text that don't resonate for him, keeping the epic conflict involving Rorschach, Ozymandias, and Dr. Manhattan, but losing its actual applicability, losing the ordinary people caught up in it, losing the political edge. Let's take this scene as an example. In the movie, Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan argue over whether someone is killing costumed crime fighters and the possible upcoming nuclear holocaust. And Dr. Manhattan decides to skip the dinner he and Laurie had planned with Dan Dreiberg. But in the comic, Rorschach argues with Laurie, not Dr. Manhattan, and not over the main plot, but because Rorschach doesn't care that the comedian raped Laurie's mother. Then Dr. Manhattan removes Rorschach at Laurie's request, but he won't show any emotional presence for her, which is what drives her to Dan Dreiberg's companionship. What's lost here, among other things, is establishing Rorschach's hypocrisy, that his ideology is just an excuse for the people he approves of to exercise power over those he doesn't, and the underpinnings of Laurie's whole arc. Snyder removes the argument and all of the things that come with it because he doesn't respond to it. He doesn't think it's important. And that's telling because these things are the real human relationships, the political and social critiques, the applicability of the story to the real world, and the humanization of Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan's superhero psychologies. He's replaced it with new dialogue focused on the apocalyptic clash of superegos. Notice that Snyder preserves Rorschach's decision to stop being Walter because it seems rad, but he removes Laurie's reclaiming of her last name, Uspechik, and literally takes that name out of the story entirely. For some critics, Snyder's unself-conscious focus on powerful great man imagery brings Snyder's work, unintentionally, into the space of fascist or authoritarian art. But for me, Snyder's work lacks the thematic purpose to be taken all the way there. He looks at imagery that is powerful because it connects to big social and political ideas, and he wants to push a button that somehow keeps the power without those connections. All of this leaves his Watchmen in an odd place. As an adaptation of meaning, themes, or ideas, it's, at best, limited. Beyond the idea of superheroes but like gritty, it communicates few of its source's ideas and none of its own through the new medium. And yet, as an adaptation of the imagery, it's so faithful and so effective that it becomes functionally canonical. It's 2017. The President of the United States is, well, you know who he is. And somehow this section won't have anything to do with that. Because there's more Watchmen in 2017 and somehow it's managed to have nothing to do with that. Every so often in the DC Comics universe, the weight of the lore becomes so heavy that they decide to purge the whole thing and start over with a big event comic called A Crisis. But the key thing about A Crisis is that it doesn't actually delete the old lore. A lot of people, both on the creative side and the customer side, are really attached to some of those stories, some of those versions of characters. So they create an in-universe simplification of the story, usually involving time travel or collapsing multiverses or both. And then that simplification spends the next few years cracking open. Old story items get brought back, and the whole thing becomes overcomplicated again. And then there has to be another crisis. In 2017, they've had the idea to, as part of that, transport some Watchmen characters into the main DC timeline, which will A, permanently establish the Watchmen as part of the DC multiverse, so they can use them whenever they want going forward, and B, use Dr. Manhattan to retcon and or unretcon some stuff from the previous crisis that they now want back. And if none of that made sense to you, it's okay. Even when it kinda does, it's still pretty dumb. This sequence, titled Doomsday Clock, draws a lot of attention in terms of what having the Watchmen characters does for the DC universe, and while it's not totally devoid of themes or meaning, no one seems to reach the related question, why? What is this doing for Watchmen? What are these characters doing here? Stripped of the context of Watchmen, presented under the editorial constraints of the main timeline, Rorschach is just the character he once satirized. Dr. Manhattan and Ozymandias are just more Superman. There are new characters that we're supposed to believe are based on Carlton Comics characters, but clearly they just want another Joker and Harley Quinn. That reality rebounds back onto that first question. What does it mean for the DC universe to bring the Watchmen characters into it? Well, nothing. It changes nothing. It becomes a sort of accidental self-commentary. The reason you need a separate story to tell something like Watchmen becomes tangible, a sort of force field through which the designs, the bodies, and the mannerisms can pass, but the souls don't. Not just don't, but never can. It becomes the only thing you can notice, the soullessness of the whole enterprise, no matter the intentions of the people involved. It's 1986. The country is in the grip of a strange epidemic, not well understood, reported hysterically, taking tens of thousands of lives, and labeled by those with a tendency towards sensationalism with a derogatory nickname, the Gay Plague. The President of the United States is privately sympathetic to the people afflicted with HIV, even among the stigmatized gay community. He's always been less socially conservative, always been a little more Hollywood than his base is willing to believe. But he can't find a way to say it publicly. He's convinced himself that if he draws a little attention to it, the problem might just work itself out on its own. President Reagan has dramatically expanded the scale of American military operations and covert espionage overseas. Reagan's embrace of totalitarians will do damage to the progress of global democracy that will never be fully undone. In Lebanon, the United States has supported and armed an Israeli invasion, escalating the ongoing factional violence. Then, feeling a need to maintain peace, the United States has sent its own troops into Lebanon, both to prop up the weak government and to enforce Israel's original military goal, pushing the Palestinian Liberation Organization out of Lebanon. This intervention has been an abject disaster. Rather than stabilize Lebanon, the US's intervention has destroyed any domestic political capital held by the US's local allies and radicalized both the general population and every faction not aligned with the US. In April 1983, a suicide bombing at the US Embassy kills 53. In October 1983, a suicide bombing at a barracks in Beirut kills 299. Even sympathetic Lebanese officials turn on the US and demand that its forces leave, and by February 1984, the US's position has become completely untenable. Lebanon enters a period of prolonged civil war. Similar stories are playing out in Afghanistan, in Guatemala, in Libya. Some of these nations will eventually recover and re-emerge. Others never will. Nixon himself is not far from the White House. He is frequently lauded as a statesman. He speaks on public policy and in support of Reagan. He attends state events and travels to visit leaders of foreign countries. No one seems to want to say Nixon does well on overseas trips because the people most impressed by him are the authoritarians, the totalitarians, and the dictators. The first issue of a strange new superhero comic has hit newsstands. It's from British independent comics veteran writer and Doctor Who Weekly alumnus Alan Moore, and British underground comics veteran artist and Doctor Who Weekly alumnus Dave Gibbons. Watchmen immediately stands out as something unusual. Even DC, who were initially cautious, have recognized that Watchmen is something different and are promoting it hard. Over the course of this year and the next, Watchmen will tell the story of a 1985 like our 1985, and a world like our world. In this world, there are costumed crime fighters, people inspired by the first vigilante comics to put on costumes and punch out crooks themselves. And then there's the one man with superpowers, the Superman. He exists. And he's American. As their world flings itself toward nuclear annihilation, one former hero, Adrian Veidt, the self-styled smartest man in the world, resolves to save humanity from itself, manufacturing a fake alien attack on New York City that will kill millions, and by creating an overpowering threat to all factions, unite humans in common cause. Watchmen is too complicated. It deals with too many subjects in too scattershot a way to pull upon one thread and say, this is what it means. I hope this essay doesn't give off that impression. Watchmen means a lot of things, and there's much I haven't found a place to discuss. I'm only trying to engage with it as well as I can. So, let's talk about this. The four crime fighters that Watchmen's story revolves around, Dr. Manhattan, Ozymandias, the comedian, and Rorschach, each represent an ideology, a strategy for responding to society that doesn't require complication or concession. In a sense, this is what makes them the Supermen. Their unyielding embrace of such a strategy makes them forces of nature that ordinary people can't negotiate with. For Rorschach, that strategy is a conspiratorial objectivism, a view that society is corrupted by relativism, that anyone failing to follow their dogma is weak, that any social rules imposed on him are therefore a double standard by the weak, the corrupt, the relativists. Dr. Manhattan retreats into perfect social alienation. He rejects the possibility of being influenced by anything chaotic, anything not perfectly understandable. Ozymandias can't accept the world as it is. He has to replace it with a perfectly ordered one, a society without flaws, where he happens to dress as Alexander the Great and everyone answers to him. The comedian has embraced the self-justifying nihilism of the 4chan troll, that there are no moral rules, only layers of bullshit stacked on top of the cruel joy of wielding the power you have over others just because you can. In fact, all these responses, while different, are nihilistic and conservative in that they reflect a frustration at a perceived new complexity in the world, and a desire to reimpose order and cultural superiority upon it. The comedian and Dr. Manhattan find natural homes in the Nixonian institutions of power, and Rorschach and Ozymandias only reject the Nixonian order for not going far enough. Watchmen sympathizes to some degree with each of these four characters, but it doesn't trust them, because these chucklefucks, these are the Watchmen, and some motherfuckers gotta watch them. 13 years from now I will not get this, because I won't get Dan and Laurie. And this story isn't this story without Dan and Laurie. Not superheroes, not really, but people who idolized superheroes, who loved superheroes, who came to adulthood in the shadows of superheroes, who are now revisiting this thing that was so important to them when they were discovering who they were. Whatever the dodge with the Carlton Comics characters, Dan is dressed as basically Batman, and there's some Batman there, but surrounded by these supermen, he's more like Robin. A latecomer, an outsider, part of the crew, but not a part of the conversation. He's too soft. He has no staying power. He's a person, not an ideology. He cares only in the way that people care. It would be nice to say, who watches The Watchmen? Dan and Laurie do. Ordinary people do. But that's not what happens. They can't stop Fate's plan, and they can't fight him. They can't save Rorschach from Dr. Manhattan. They want to, but they can't. It's 1986. The world is in the grips of a conflict of ideologies. Not political ideologies, not really, but ideologies of power. Rhetorical frameworks that justify people who want power getting to have power. And the doomsday clock ticks toward midnight. Though it splits off somewhat earlier, in many ways Watchmen's real inflection point is in Vietnam. The same president that pushed his advisors to consider using nuclear weapons on North Vietnam, the one who bombed and then invaded Cambodia, feels no compunction about sending Dr. Manhattan to win the war for him. And he does. But the war is the comedian's war, a nihilistic war, a war over who gets to say they won the war, that squeezes all the ordinary people until they burst, legitimized by an ideological righteousness that's come completely unstuck from any applicability. The America that won is perhaps meaner and more self-assured than the confused, anxious nation that retreated, but either way, it will always be a scar on the face of the American soul, the soul that wanted to have its fun and then forget about Vietnam forever. Speaking of the comedian, Dr. Manhattan says, "As I come to understand Vietnam and what it implies about the human condition, I also realize that few humans will permit themselves such an understanding. Blake's different. He understands perfectly, and he doesn't care." It's 1986. Vietnam is over. But in Lebanon and Guatemala and Libya and Grenada and Afghanistan, the spirit of Vietnam is distinctly felt. It's 1986, and Richard Nixon is still the president. It's 2019. The president is a habitual tax cheat, a serial groper, a purveyor of bigoted conspiracy theories, a friend to white supremacists. His eclectic, unfocused foreign policy has left the American global position in tatters. Its efforts to strengthen its position in East and Southeast Asia in collapse. Its relationships with longtime allies in Europe teetering. Its rivals in China and Russia shifting to more confrontational, radical, and anti-Western positions. Richard Nixon has been dead for 25 years, but his people aren't all gone. Take Roger Stone, who worked as one of Richard Nixon's illegal activities hatchetmen. 40 years later, he's a critical go-between between the president's campaign and both Russian operatives seeking to manipulate American elections and white supremacist and neo-Nazi factions that see themselves as the vanguard of a white nationalist movement that, in their opinion, the president leads. In a year, the president, having become convinced that any political process that can select his opponents is by definition illegitimate, will, with the support of large parts of a major political party, a violent and insurrectionary ethno-nationalist movement, at least one right-wing tech billionaire, and some of the most prominent news personalities in the country, attempt to functionally end American democracy. There has never been, since 1986, a time more suited to Watchmen. And there's more Watchmen. This one is from Damon Lindelof, who's best known for helping to write a lot of Lost and Star Trek Into Darkness. You know, the one that totally doesn't have Khan. What the show is trying to do, clearly, is to step into a very specific narrative space that leverages historical events or works through a lens of fictionalization or alternate history to comment on the reappearing specter of fascism and tyranny today. Think The Man in the High Castle or The Plot Against America. That instinct is interesting, but there's a wide range of quality here. At the top, there's some stuff that's really remarkable. At the bottom, there's the recent David O. Russell calamity, Amsterdam, where it becomes clear that the whole instinct is just a desperate attempt to get toasted at Hollywood parties for making important work. Somehow, Watchmen is on the remarkable side. It's by far the best of Watchmen's adaptations and continuations. No, that's low praise. It stands next to the graphic novel comfortably. Not just an adaptation, and not just a sequel, but something that knows why Watchmen is good, and develops it with confidence. One of the things about the Watchmen comic is, well, it's super white. What I mean is it wants to have its class politics without race politics. Not without discrimination, but without reflecting the way that politics are shaped by whiteness. Which is to say, by how lasting political alliances and ultimately public policy are shaped by racial biases and perceived threat. This is emblematic of a certain kind of hard-left politics, probably exacerbated by Moore and Gibbons being Brits, and having a perspective on American society shaped by the similar but not identical dynamics at play in Britain. And while that isn't the thrust of this essay, it's a limitation of the graphic novel that it wants to talk about ideology and power in America without engaging race, really at all. Watchmen the show begins with a recreation of the Tulsa Race Massacre. In 1921, a young black shoeshiner in Tulsa needed to use the restroom. He went down the street and got in an elevator to use an upstairs restroom, the nearest restroom that a black man was allowed to use. The elevator operator was a young white woman he knew, and then he tripped and fell, and she shouted, and he, wisely, fled. Wisely because that was all it took. A nearby clerk, who hadn't seen anything, heard the shout and saw him leave, called the police and said he had tried to rape her. For her own part, the operator said he had only grabbed her arm, and though he was arrested, he was never going to be charged. But he was going to be lynched. The sheriff attempted to protect him, but hundreds of white people gathered outside the courthouse demanding that he be turned over to them. A smaller group of black men went to the jail to attempt to safely escort him away. The crowd of would-be lynchers grew and grew. No one knows who fired the first shot, or why, but we know what happened next. The smaller group of black men retreated to Greenwood, the nearby majority black neighborhood, and the crowd of lynchers pursued them, escalating to looting and attacking any black men they saw. Over the next day, white rioters set fire to most of the city's black neighborhoods, and killed as many as several hundred black Tulsans. We don't know how many, because we haven't found the mass graves they were buried in. Airplanes full of rioters firebombed black neighborhoods. Though some law enforcement officers had tried to halt the initial lynching, when law enforcement did step into the riot, many just joined in. When the riot eventually ended, more liberal white Tulsans were convinced that a grand effort was needed by the city and state to rebuild Tulsa's black neighborhoods. They declared their intention to do so, and then it just never happened. 80 years later, in 2001, the state of Oklahoma passed a law for the survivors and inheritors of the victims to receive the following compensation: the construction of a memorial, an unspecified declaration that Greenwood should qualify for redevelopment programs to the extent that they already exist, and 300 vocational college scholarships for people from Tulsa who might or might not be descendants of victims. Not one rioter was ever convicted of any crime. What I'm saying is to reference this, not just to reference this, to depict it. To go out of your way by 100 years to depict it is a statement. There is no class politics without race politics. This is one incident among many. It is one incident of a history. This show isn't perfect. It's a little too interested in adding to the Watchmen lore in a way that sometimes draws attention away from the critique. The show also has a significant interest in something else from the comic, something foundational really about the comic, people mirroring stories both in further media and in real life. Within the show, the events of the comic, which is to say, Watchmen itself, is a model for people's behavior in ways that are intended and ways that aren't. White supremacists wear Rorschach masks, but the masked police officers also call their masks faces. There is both a real and a fictional history of the character of Hooded Justice. There is a cultural memory of Dr. Manhattan and a real legacy of Dr. Manhattan, and its investigation of this subject is really interesting, though again, it's a little bit sabotaged by lore. Within the show is a fictional show called American Hero Story, a parody of the American Story franchise that tells a sensationalized and speculative version of the story of Hooded Justice, one of the original costumed crime fighters. This show is an homage to Watchmen's fictional comic Tales of the Black Freighter, which reflected the story of Ozymandias in a different narrative light. But American Hero Story isn't quite the same thing. If both American Hero Story and Tales of the Black Freighter are opportunities to comment on their respective mediums, it feels like Tales of the Black Freighter is saying, "I love you, comics," and American Hero Story is saying, "I love you, television." But it seems to say to the audience, "I know that this is what you would have been satisfied by, but that's on you." The Watchmen show is a closed-form story. Theoretically, it could be renewed at some point, but Lindelof has said that the 9 episodes of Watchmen that exist are the entirety of his commentary. The graphic novel worked as a closed story. Honoring it, extending it thoughtfully, required a closed-form story itself. Lindelof has suggested that some other creator could pick up from him and make their own closed-form story, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen, and that might be for the best. Watchmen, the graphic novel, is 12 issues long, and it's over, and it was good. Watchmen, the show, is 9 episodes long, and it's over, and it was good. It's 1787. Soon, George Washington will become the first president of the United States. One day, he will become a private opponent of slavery, but he'll never say so publicly, having convinced himself that if he draws little attention to it, the problem might just work itself out on its own. Upon his death, he will manumit those people he is legally permitted to free, only a small portion of the enslaved people on his estate, and set aside portions of his wealth to provide for them. But now he is spending much of the decade pressuring Britain to return to servitude those who escaped slavery during the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson is the U.S. ambassador to France. He is 44 years old. With him is a black girl named Sally Hemings, enslaved at Monticello and sent to Paris to serve Jefferson personally. Along the way, she spent 6 weeks with John and Abigail Adams in London before they dutifully sent her along to their friend Thomas. Her family remains in captivity in Virginia. It is said that Hemings looks a great deal like Jefferson's deceased wife Martha. No surprise, they were half-sisters. Martha, born to John Wales and his first wife, considered white, and born free. Sally, born of John Wales' frequent rapes of the enslaved woman Betty Hemings, considered black, and born in slavery. A sexual relationship begins. Sally is 30 years Thomas's junior. Yes, 14 years old. History will spend the next 200 years trying to complicate the world's least complicated moral question. Romance novels will be written about them. In the 2008 miniseries John Adams, Hemings will be present in the story only so she can be shown grieving Jefferson's death. In the 1995 film Jefferson in Paris, Hemings will be played by 23-year-old Thandiwe Newton. It's 1787. It's 1974. It's 1986, 2009, 2017, 2019, and 2022. And nothing ever ends, Adrian. Nothing ever ends.